This is The Jason Jones Show, powered by Mudhouse Media. Now, here's Jason Jones.
Aloha, everybody, and welcome to The Jason Jones Show. I am your host, Jason Jones, broadcasting from the hill country of Texas. You may notice I lost my voice. I was traveling. I was in Washington, D.C. I was in Louisville, Kentucky. I had some speeches, had a lot of meetings, had a lot of media over the past 7 days, and a lot of travel. And my voice, I left parts of it all across our great land. I got to be at a dinner with the vice president a couple of nights ago. Last night, I had one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. I was at the Sisters for Life annual fundraising dinner, and the Sisters for Life is an organization of black women in Louisville, Kentucky, who go to the abortion clinics in the black neighborhoods that prey on young black women. And they give them all of the care and support they need so they can choose life. I watched them give a young woman a scholarship to Howard, and I heard of all their great work, so I got to do that. Had dinner the night before that with the vice president. The day before that, I was on Steve Bannon's The War Room, and it was a great trip. I met with some of the folks, the legal team that's involved in this great struggle against corruption and fraud that is disenfranchising you of your right to vote. I met with Salih Hidayah, who is the prime minister in exile for Chinese-occupied East Turkestan. We met and discussed how we would go forward, if Biden is indeed president, how we would go forward to advance the interests of the Uyghur and Chinese-occupied East Turkestan. Had a lot of good meetings. Steve Bannon was on the last episode. If you didn't catch it, you got to listen to it. And on that note, this episode is being brought to you. John Zmirak is our guest today, so let's just say that. We're going to talk about his new article. But in my interview with Steve, he mentioned the work of Movie to Movement and the Vulnerable People Project, our sponsors. And he said that it was your work. He said this. You just go listen to it. He said it was your work, primarily your work, Jason. He said that. That the Trump administration and the Trump movement is standing side to side, shoulder to shoulder with these vulnerable ethnic minorities like the Yazidi, like the Uyghur. And he thanked me on the air, on the War Room, and on the interview. He thanked us for our work to advance the interests of the vulnerable. And that is our job, to stand between the violent and the vulnerable, to know that we are not helpless, that we are privileged, and that we will share our privileges with those who are vulnerable, those who are placed in a position of helplessness because they are in a concentration camp in China, because they are in an ISIS camp in Syria. Our mission is to stand for and with those people. The child in the womb is vulnerable. You are not. I am not. We are not helpless. And if you want to stand with those who are vulnerable, you become a monthly donor to the Vulnerable People Project, because we have our work cut out for us. And I'm like Patton. If you give me gas to go 20 miles, I go 30. And I run out of gas, so we need some gas. We need your support. So go to thegreatcampaign.org, become a monthly donor, and you get a free copy of my book that I wrote with John Zmirak, The Race to Save Our Century, where we talked about the rise of genocide, democide, and total war in the 21st century. We published it a couple of years ago. People thought we were off our rockers, that we were greatly exaggerating the challenges ahead. Well, they're here. The challenges are here. And that's what we're talking about with John Zmirak about today, as if my voice can hold out. We're talking to John Zmirak about learned helplessness, how the left, it wants to train you to keep your mouth shut. Sit in your house, order some food from Uber Eats, watch Netflix, and if you're a good boy, we might even send you another $1,200 check. You're helpless. We're here to care for you. Do what you're told. And that's what we're talking to the great John Zmirak about. So sit back and here we go. Jason Jones Show. Aloha, John Zmirak. Welcome to the Jason Jones Show.
Thanks, Jason. It's great to be on.
So, each one of your articles I read, I say, this is the best article John ever wrote. But then you posted on Twitter your most recent article on learned helplessness, although the best line in the article was the protocols of the elders of Jamestown. That was a winner. I'm using that. You said this was the most personal article that you wrote in years. Was it because it was about beagles or because it was about saving your republic?
It was because of the beagles.
I figured as much.
Sorry.
If people only knew how much.
By the way, I just want to explain that. I want to explain that reference. The Protocols of the Elders of Jamestown is my term for the 1619 Project, which is an outrageous conspiracy theory cooked up by journalists and hack academics to argue that the United States was founded specifically in 1776 to protect the institution of slavery from the great emancipator King George III, which of course he was not.
I mean, you'd have to be illiterate. I mean, it is just a fantasy, right? But you'd have to be almost historically illiterate, culturally illiterate to believe that. I don't know if what was the New York Times believes it, or if they're just. The New York
Times, backed by the Pulitzer Committee, it's now being taught in schools in like 28 states, thanks to teachers' unions. I just want to be clear about the history here. Even left-wing historians came out against this madness. It is well known that the first abolitionist movement in history started in Pennsylvania with a Quaker, an American, and that William Wilberforce didn't even get started on trying to suppress the slave trade in Britain until after U.S. independence. The Declaration of Independence and our Constitution actually were the sparks that lit the movement for international abolition. Slavery is something that has existed in every human society for all of history, and the U.S. was the first place to have an abolitionist movement emerge from the principles of our founding and from biblical morality. And the 1619 Project was intended to flip that over, to invert the reality and make America seem like it was evil from its foundation because it's uniquely dedicated to slavery. Every single bit of that is a lie. But people believing that is why we saw statues of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass torn down in public squares across America.
I mean, Frederick Douglass, it's really unbelievable. Why were they tearing down statues of Fred? Was it they just didn't know who he was, or did they have a gripe against Frederick Douglass?
They might not have known who he was. They should have noticed that he was obviously black. But if they did know who he was, they would have hated him anyway because he was devoted to the American founding. He said the American founding was incompatible with slavery, that our Constitution was not a slaveholder's Constitution. The people who agree, the people who claim that ours was a slaveholder's republic, they were agreeing with the Confederates. They were agreeing with Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, and Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson, who believed that slavery was intended to be protected in the Constitution rather than reluctantly tolerated, which is in fact the historical reality.
And Robert E. Lee didn't believe that, and most definitely founding fathers like George Mason, who went into a deep depression, that the weed of slavery that was growing from prehistory into the North America, that weed was growing long before our republic was founded, went into a deep depression because slavery was a part of our republic, and men like John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and you're right.
I do want to fight for our republic, but the reason this article meant a lot to me was because I started with my beagles. Here's what the article is. I talk about the psychological concept of learned helplessness, and when I started doing research, it kind of broke my heart to realize psychologists discovered learned helplessness by cruel experiments on dogs in labs. They would shock the dog, and then it would move to get away from the shock and would get shocked again. And they set up a situation of total helplessness and hopelessness where whatever the dog did, it got punished. And they found the dogs then just laid there and got shocked and didn't even care. Just didn't even react. And even when they could escape the shock, they didn't. They didn't even try because they had given in to absolute despair. That is what the Democrats want from us. After 4 years of claiming election fraud based on zero evidence, of making up nonsense about Vladimir Putin first hacking the voting machines and then somehow manipulating our election with $700 worth of crude Facebook ads, and then allegedly hacking the DNC's computers, and then allegedly colluding with Carter Page and George Papadopoulos and Mike Flynn, destroying the lives of innocent people like General Flynn and Papadopoulos and Page, and getting a whole special counsel investigation using illegal fake FISA warrants, then impeaching President Trump over a single phone call to Ukraine, which we now know, thanks to the Hunter Biden laptop, was entirely legitimate. And that laptop was sitting in the FBI's offices, and they wouldn't share it with Trump, even though it was exculpatory evidence. Well, if you read Sidney Powell, who is now on Trump's legal team, if you read her brilliant book, License to Lie, you'll know that federal prosecutors routinely hide exculpatory evidence. And one of the worst offenders was Andrew Weissman, whose protege was Christopher Wray, the current head of the FBI. So it all ties together, a pattern of miscarriages of justice, false illegal prosecutions, abuse of our secret intelligence agencies, all to undermine and nullify the election of the 2016 election. But after all that, we're supposed to believe the Democrats would never cheat to win an election in 2020.
Yeah, no.
The only way you could believe that is if you have already succumbed to learned helplessness, and you are already so beaten down and passive thanks to the virus lockdowns, your church being closed, your job maybe going away, and the economy being crashed, constant new threats of lockdown. Everything seems designed to break the spirit of the American people, the way the spirits were broken in Eastern Europe in 1948, in Prague and in Berlin, in Budapest, and all those countries where the Soviets stole elections to impose communism after World War II.
Well, John, people might feel helpless also because they try to share information, maybe a Veritas video showing voter corruption or a whistleblower telling their story, and then you share it on Facebook from a mainstream news outlet, and then you're banned for 24 hours, or you were banned for a week on Twitter. Or Mark DeYoung, right, the writer Mark DeYoung, who emailed me about writing an article calling on a day of prayer and penance for our nation. When he tried to email me the article through Google email, it said that this email contains dangerous material, and he could not email it through Google Mail, through Gmail.
Oh, wow. I have not heard of it spreading to email. That's really creepy.
Yeah, it said that this could be dangerous content. So people feel helpless. So walk folks through who do feel help. The election's happened. It's gone to the courts. We have lawyers like Sidney Powell, who is a warrior. I mean, that woman has nerves of steel. You watch her on television.
Yeah, let's talk. I know her. I worked with her. I did PR for her book. So I used to share an office with her for about almost a year in New York. She is absolutely rigorously honest. This is someone who was a federal prosecutor. She quit because of all the abuses, the failure to provide exculpatory evidence, the witch hunt after innocent people and companies like Arthur Anderson. She quit and went into private practice to represent defendants against abusive federal prosecutors. And then she took two or 3 years off of her very profitable private practice to write a book exposing all these horrendous evils of the deep state. And frankly, I was only able to read about a third of it because it was so upsetting. It was so frightening. And all of this back in 2015, before we saw the last 4 years of insanity. And you know what else is designed to help us achieve learned helplessness? Fox News switching sides on election night. Fox News firing Jeanine Pirro, banning conservative guests, cutting away from the president and the president's press secretary when they try to present evidence of electoral fraud. That's been particularly demoralizing and ominous for a lot of people. Now there is no mainstream news media outlet that will report what half the country believes.
Well, you quit Drudge Report in 1999, which is amazing. So, but most people are trained. They go to Fox News, they go to Drudge. That's the first thing they do every morning. You go to Drudge, and Drudge didn't just drift. Drudge just flipped teams so dramatically. It's unbelievable. But people are still trained. You go to Drudge, you go to Fox, you go to Drudge, you go to Fox.
Well, you know what? Jason, they're rebelling. I got to give you some good news. Fox has lost half its viewership to Newsmax in the last week.
That's beautiful. That's what we moved in the past week. So you were the first. I'm slow. I don't actually watch cable news, to be fair. I started watching it during the election just to kind of observe the coverage more than anything. But now I switched to Newsmax, and it's been great. I was on Steve Bannon's show, which they aired on Newsmax last week, which was great. But and you can't go to the church. We're Catholic. You can't look for the Pope's tweets. So I think of that book by Hannah Arendt, where she talked about thinking without banisters. She said, in the wake of Nietzsche and Heidegger, we're thinking without banisters. Well, now we have to live without banisters. So that's that helplessness, but it's also an adventure. So walk us. I want people to go to thestream.org to read this article. The Stream should be your first place every day. Rumor has it is it's the president's first news source every day, but it should be your first news source every day. It is the first place I go. John, your article is the first thing I read every morning. So,
well, thanks. I write five columns a week at stream.org, and I often go on the Architecture show to talk about them. But stream.org, I have 5 columns a week. My new column, which is going to go up in a few hours, is an interview about Syria. Now, this should be of interest to your listeners. They're trying to trick Donald Trump into abandoning the Syrian Christians and the Kurds and pulling out the U.S. advisors that currently prevent Turkey from invading the region and handing it over to al-Qaeda. And the person doing it is named James Jeffrey. He used to be the U.S. State Department envoy to Syria. He is now putting out a false story that Donald Trump was tricked and that he, in the State Department, purposely fooled Donald Trump in order to prevent a pullout from Syria after the defeat of ISIS. So what he's saying is, we tricked you, ha ha. And he's trying to get Trump now to pull out of Syria. But in fact, and I just learned this from Johannes de Jong, who is an expert on the region and has been working with the Syrian Christians, James Jeffrey never supported U.S. policy in Syria. James Jeffrey supported the Obama policy, which was to help the al-Qaeda rebels, who were backed by Turkey, take over the entire country. And that's why James Jeffrey is trying to trick the president into pulling our few advisors out of Syria by making our successful policy in Syria seem like our failed policy in Afghanistan. So they're trying to get Syrian Christians slaughtered and subjected to al-Qaeda and to Turkish occupation by manipulating the president. And that's going to be my next scoop.
I wasn't even aware of this, John, so thank you. I want to do a whole show on this. Maybe you can help me get Johannes de Jong, because my great fear, in fact, we just did a strategy session with the Vulnerable People Project. Our 2 great fears under a Biden presidency would be war in Syria, completely abandoning the Kurds and the Christians in the region to genocide and democide, and also the Uyghurs and famine. I mean, so these are the 3 great concerns of a Biden presidency.
Let me make your day worse. Kamala Harris has promised that she will support the al-Qaeda rebels taking over all of Syria if she and Biden take office.
Where did she say this?
I don't know. It was in a press thing. I mean, it was in a mainstream media thing. She said, we are going to militarily support the rebels, by which she means al-Qaeda. The same people, it's funny, Kamala Harris, John McCain, James Jeffrey, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, across all their political differences, they all agree on wanting al-Qaeda, the people who bomb New York, flew planes into our buildings in New York and Washington, they want al-Qaeda to run that country, which has 1 million Christians, hundreds of thousands of Yazidis, and Alawites and other religious minorities who will be persecuted, subject to genocide. We know this for a fact because when these Syrian rebels took over Afrin in Syria, they ethnically cleansed the place, drove out all the Kurds, burned all the churches, imposed the same kind of fundamentalist Islamist regime that they want all across the region.
And people don't believe that. I know there are people listening going, nobody would want that. It happened under the Obama-Biden administration. We watched our ancient Christian communities liquidated. Wherever Assad was pushed back in Syria, the Christians were liquidated. The bishops and patriarchs begged the United States to side with Assad against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and groups that are even, believe it or not, more extreme, more cruel, more vicious. And this is what we are looking at under a Biden-Obama presidency. I just
want to point out.
Yes.
I want to point out, we're not stuck between the choice of Assad or Al-Qaeda. The Kurds and the Syrian Christians created a third option of the region in northeastern Syria that they took control of before completely defeating ISIS as America's allies. There is religious freedom. There's freedom for women. Women are represented in parliament. There's local government. So it's not the grim choice between Assad's dictatorship, which is secular, and Al-Qaeda's religiously fanatical theocratic regime. The Kurds and the Christians are a third force that actually preserves religious freedom and have reached out to ally with Israel. They are natural allies for the U.S. And James Jeffrey, who just left the State Department, is trying to trick Trump into pulling our troops out and letting the Turks destroy this island of religious freedom and democracy in the region.
Okay, I know you have to jump on a big show coming up here, so I'll wrap this up with this. I don't want people to feel more helpless. Walk us through, in the article you go through your beagles, when you rescued them, they had been shocked into silence that they didn't have fur around their necks. And it took them months.
Right.
They would run around, like you said, like silent ninja beagle dogs. And it took them months before one of them accidentally barked and realized that they weren't shocked. And then sooner or later, both of them, you said, were running around like beagles should, barking away at everything.
They got me evicted from my apartment. I have the eviction notice to prove it.
Well, help us get you evicted from America. How do we start barking like your beagles? How do we help us unlearn?
Okay, I'll tell you what I think the best thing that could happen. You remember that march this past weekend on D.C., which was fine during the day, and then at night, Antifa and Black Lives Matter attacked the peaceful demonstrators. I think we should have another MAGA march on Washington, and it should be open carry. Everybody should be packing heat and carrying their long guns in defiance of Washington, D.C.'s unconstitutional gun laws. They can't arrest 500,000 people. I want the left to know we are dead serious. They are not going to take our guns. They're not going to keep our churches closed. They're not going to rewrite or tear up the Constitution, hack the Supreme Court, get rid of the Electoral College. We are not putting up with that. They are a revolutionary force that's trying to use the power of the deep state and a media monopoly to destroy the America we inherited from our parents and we hope to leave to our children. We're not going to put up with it. They're trying to impose a color revolution like the one they did in Ukraine when the CIA overthrew the elected government and put in someone that the Obama administration favored. If they try a color revolution in America, it's not going to look like Ukraine. It's going to look like Afghanistan, with us in the role of the Taliban, making the occupiers miserable and hunting them down and destroying them. We are not going to put up with that. They are not going to have a nice, peaceful America with a population of slaves with learned helplessness. It's going to look more like Kabul.
Yeah, I don't think it'll even look like Kabul. I think that they'll just fold they'll fold because they don't believe that we'll stand up. But as soon as we stand up, they'll fold, right?
It can't be one guy like Kyle Rittenhouse or Jake Gardner, God rest his soul. It has to be thousands of people at the same time. Leaderless resistance and citizens' militias, to the point where the local police won't even try to enforce unconstitutional gun laws because it's not worth the risk. and they'll turn on the civilian officials who've been brutalizing the police, subjecting them to abuse at the hands of Antifa and Black Lives Matter for months. We need a point where people like Governor Whitmer, they can't get their orders obeyed.
Well, I'm
Just like
hearing in
Andrew
Texas, Cuomo. John, that homeowners associations and Facebook groups that are online are now going offline of homeowners associations.
Sure.
They're not calling themselves militias. They're just going by, Sleepy Howell Homeowners Association. They're meeting at guys' houses and they're discussing, what do you have? What do you have? What do you have? Okay, what are we worried about? What do we might have to protect? Are they going to come after this building or this statue?
I just got an idea, Jason. Maybe we should form fake mosques. Call ourselves mosques, because then the FBI won't touch us, won't go near us, because they don't want to be accused of Islamophobia.
Well, I think what's interesting though, even about mosques in the Muslim community, there was a truck driver strike last week. I don't know if you heard about it. Maybe not, because the media wasn't covering it.
No.
A lot of the leadership were Muslim immigrants to this country, standing with Trump.
Wow.
And I talked to several truck drivers.
That's great.
And I said, I know there are a lot of Muslim drivers, a lot of immigrant drivers from Eastern Europe. They said they're actually the leaders of the protest. They said they're the ones that are most enthusiastic about defending our liberties. These Polish truck drivers, these immigrant drivers from the Middle East. And so I think that is the real good news. And if what Sidney Powell is saying is true, that Trump even won California, is what I'm hearing, that there is a lot, but see, they've made us feel helpless. They call you a racist. They don't let you share information on social media, so you feel isolated, you feel alone, you feel like you're a kook. And but then when you discover, like we saw in these marches this weekend, that was a spontaneous, leaderless event where hundreds of thousands of people showed up with less than 2 weeks' notice from the fraud. What's going to happen is
how Facebook tried to sabotage it? They organized the event using Eventbrite, which is owned by Facebook. Not only did Facebook take down the page, but they sent false notices to 300,000 people who signed up for it, saying the event was canceled. That's how bad social media has become.
Isn't that a crime? I mean, that has to be some sort of crime.
Yeah.
You would think, or at least they should be liable for some sort of civil damages.
Yeah, they ought to be. But what we need is to treat social media the way we treated the phone company in the 1980s. The phone company was never this bad. Ma Bell did not listen to your conversations, decide it didn't like what you were saying, hang up the call and cancel your phone service. And yet we broke them up as a dangerous monopoly. Facebook and Twitter and Google are infinitely more dangerous than the phone company ever was. We need to break them up into 50 pieces and subject them to local state regulators.
Could you imagine if Ma Bell in the 70s, you were on the phone having a conversation with your friend, and someone just broke in and said, false information, partially false.
Yeah.
I don't you love when they say partially false? Partially, what does that mean, partially false? I share jokes. About 25% of my jokes get notices that it's false information or partially false. And I'm thinking, ideologues, we wrote this in our book, John, that ideologues are humorless. That our ideologues are humorless. And I think it's ironic that it's not, maybe it's just, it's intriguing. It's interesting that when you share a joke on social media, it gets a warning that this is false information.
Think about this. The reason these social media companies are immune to libel suits is because they're allegedly neutral platforms, not publishers. What is more like a publisher than saying, you can't say this, it's not true, or it's offensive? That's literally the definition of a publisher. These companies are acting in blatant disregard of the very legal provisions that allow them to exist. It's obvious they need to be stripped of the Section 230 immunity. Unfortunately, too many legislators, too many Republican legislators are on the take from these massively rich companies and have betrayed us and sided with them against the people. Those legislators need to be kicked out of office.
Yeah, and that note, John, you and I write together. We have never been so brutally edited as we have been by Facebook, right? Have you ever had an editor more aggressive with your writing than Facebook?
Once, and I never wrote for them again.
Once.
I don't know if your listeners remember, I was locked out of Twitter for a week. Did we already talk about that on the No, we locked out on the show that got deleted by accident because of a tech problem.
Yeah,
So
quote
let me tell
unquote tech.
that
Yeah.
story quickly. I was banned from Twitter for a week. I couldn't comment. I couldn't do anything except read it and send private messages. Here's why. There was a legislator in Seattle. He was actually a city commissioner, and he voted not to completely defund the Seattle Police Department. As a result, Antifa descended on his home and were throwing bricks and bottles at the windows of his home where he lived with his fiancée. He was terrorized. His neighbors were terrorized. They were cowering inside while a violent political mob attacked. I wrote on Twitter, he should shoot them because they're throwing potentially deadly weapons at his home. And that got me labeled as I was advocating violence, so I got banned. Not the Antifa people conducting the actual assault, but I got banned for recommending he defend himself.
Yeah, if anyone ever threw bricks in my house, they can be assured that I would defend myself. And I would defend my family. That's absolutely
That's right.
And that's not, and what's even more frightening is they encourage and defend away this violence. You know, they're not covering on the mainstream news outlets elderly people getting punched in the face by hordes of young Antifa people. By the way, they need to travel in hordes. You want to know, John, there's a weird phenomena I have never noticed before. And in the past month, I've seen it several times. Grown adults traveling with stuffed animals. Have you ever seen this?
No.
Grown adults clinching stuffed animals. And so on my flight from DC,
you think they have pistols inside, or is it just like an emotional problem?
No, they're in planes. They're clutching. They're scared, and they usually have all these like LGBT or BLM, all kinds of pins on them. But then they have a stuffed animal. They're clinching really tight. So on my flight from DC to Louisville, there was this man with hoop earrings and really skinny. I've never seen anyone this frail. Young person. They had a backpack covered in pins with, Amy Coney Barrett's a Nazi and BLM and LGBTQ, all these pins, more pins than you can imagine. And this young man, probably in his early 20s, when I was in my early 20s, that was my peak. I was fit. I was a young warrior. This young man in his early 20s, hoop earrings, backpack covered in pins, was clinging to a stuffed animal. And I am
This is the guy who's going to throw bricks.
For sure. No, he was leaving D.C. I am sure he was in D.C. for semantics, right? I'm just guessing. He was, he definitely looked the part. Yet when he's alone, he's clinging to a grown man. I stopped my stuffed animal Momo, John, and I probably stopped hanging out before my third birthday. You know what I mean? Momo and I were really close. I did carry Momo around. I didn't cling to him. I think, he was a donkey, I think, ironically. I had Momo the donkey, and I took a shoelace and made a leash, and I dragged this poor stuffed animal down the street. But by the time I was 3, I put Momo away. And you know what I traded Momo for? Little green army men. Little green army.
Yeah, exactly.
This guy, we need to transition all these stuffed animal carrying soy boys. We need to bring them those little green bags. You'd go into the Walgreens. I can still the smell of drugstores triggers dopamine in my brain. And I get very excited because as a kid, when I would go to the Walgreens with my grandmother, I would, you know how they have a distinct smell, these stores like Walgreens and CVS? That smell to me is little green army men. That's the smell of my grandma's about to buy me little green army men. So we need to give all these guys flying around with their stuffed animals little green army men. Maybe that's the first step.
Well, one of the stories that really struck me was there was a guy, an Antifa rioter, carrying around, I think, propane or something, one of the ingredients for Molotov cocktails. He was carrying around bottles and accelerants, in order to set fire at police stations. He got arrested. The moment he was arrested, and we have this on video, he dropped to the sidewalk, curled up in a fetal ball, and started sobbing hysterically, accusing the police of abusing him. They had barely touched it. I thought maybe that was acting, because one of the Antifa tactics is they attack you and they yell, "Why are you hitting me? Stop assaulting me!" Because they're hoping to get fake evidence in case it goes to court. But I think in this case, this was genuinely the psychological fragility of these cry bullies who spend their entire lives not being confronted with alternative ideas. In fact, in college, if anybody confronts them with alternative viewpoints, they try to get that person fired because he makes them feel unsafe. They really feel unsafe if you don't obey their ideology. If they encounter a hostile idea with sharp, pointy edges, they really start to have a psychological breakdown. This is the kind of fragile, arrogant, entitled little tyrant that our colleges and high schools have been producing. And it's very scary.
Well, if they raise their voice at me, they should feel unsafe. Don't raise your voice. That's my thing. Like, just don't even raise your voice. You might as well raise your hand at me. If you raise your voice at me, you're unsafe. Yeah. It's odd. You become very unsafe.
That's right, Jason. And I'm not a former infantryman like you, but I grew up in Queens, and I found that if I've had people get in my face, and when I start yelling, they run away. I've scared muggers off because they know. Oh wait,
they're bullies, right?
This guy's crazy.
Well, and they're bullies. They like people who don't fight back. I learned that in the 3rd grade. You know, bullies, even if they beat you up, they don't want to get scratched. They don't want to get poked in the eye. They don't want to get punched in the nose, not even once. So when they know that there are consequences to their actions with you, there'll be no actions. And that's why they literally hunted elderly people after dark that found themselves alone on their way home from the march. They did not confront the marchers. They did not. In all of my years, 31 years in conservative politics, 31 years, I don't think I ever remember them ever getting in my face. Maybe a few times, but then when my hobby is fighting. Like I fight 5 times a week. Even when I travel, I find an MMA gym. So it's like, oh, okay. Are we going to do this? They don't like that, and they immediately back down, and then they even get friendly. That's the interesting. Oh, then they're all of a sudden they're your friend. They want to. Where are you from? You're not like the other ones. Ha ha ha. As soon as you stand up, they came to my town, New Braunfels. The Antifa BLM came, and they were greeted by a lot of guys in trucks with rifles when they came into New Braunfels.
That's what needs to happen nationwide.
And you know what they did? They got out of their car and they said, "Oh," my friend was one of the organizers, and he said, "Yeah." They got out and they said, "Oh, you don't want us here? We only go to towns we're wanted." So that must, that's who knew that Antifa only destroys towns that want to be destroyed. You did something earlier, John, which I pay attention to because I studied this in grad school. Frame theory, frame analysis, how words, how people file words, and the real meaning of words. You meant to say Antifa, but you said Al Qaeda, or vice versa. I forget which it was.
That's right.
When that tells me is you have Antifa and Al Qaeda in the same folder, and they should and they should be in the same folder. I was in Iraq. I saw what ISIS did to churches, and I'll tell you for a fact that if Antifa could do to us what ISIS did to our co-religionists in the Nineveh Plains, rape us, kill us, burn our churches down, they would do it. They have
done it in Argentina.
They have done
it. In Argentina, a pro-abortion march was linked to Antifa set fire to the cathedral. They tried to burn down the cathedral in Argentina. These are the same people with the same impulses. They're bullies and cowards and totalitarians, and they only understand violent force. They only understand when you fight back. And even if you're alone, Even if you feel isolated, you should think of yourself like a kamikaze pilot with nothing to lose and go after them because they will back down. They're not used to fighting people who fight back.
Fight back. You never start. Well, the last thing we would want to see, and it would bring shame and disgrace to me, would be, God forbid, the Catholics who like to pray the rosary and stand for life. I would be so ashamed. I would be out there standing shoulder to shoulder I would be an elderly leftist escort. If I saw that there were groups of Trump supporters prowling around, sucker punching elderly Bernie Sanders supporters or Biden supporters, I would form a militia to defend elderly Biden supporters because I would be so disgusted. What kind of young person prowls around with groups of young people looking to sucker punch the elderly? And I don't care what their ideology is. I don't care what their religion is.
No, but
I want to stand.
These are the kind of people.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
These are the kind of people who form the brown shirts, the young Nazi thugs who pulled rabbis around by their beards and put Jewish children into gas chambers. It's the same impulse. It's human beings reducing themselves to the level of gorillas or chimpanzees, which do murder the young of their rivals, do kill the elderly. Trump supporters don't do that. If it had ever happened, it would have been all over the media. The fact that it's not in the media means it never happened.
Good point. If it happened once, we would be hearing about it every single day, just once.
That's right.
You said they're just like the brown shirts. Oh, go ahead.
The riots in Charlottesville had nothing to do with Trump supporters. In fact, the leader of the Charlottesville riot, Richard Spencer, endorsed Joe Biden, which didn't get reported in the media.
Yeah. No, and he's a kook. Yeah, they're not. Yeah, but they get. That's the thing. They're calumny. It's slander. They love to call you racist, the Nazi, but they're the Nazis. You said that they're like the brown shirts. In many ways, they're the cohorts of the brown shirts in a real way, because that's not ancient history. One of the worst videos I've ever seen is really pathetic, and I think this took place in Canada. You might remember. It wasn't that long ago, maybe a year ago. There was an old husband and wife, and they were looked like in their 90s. And they were trying to walk across the street I think it was in Seattle. They were walking across the street, and I guess it was in a black neighborhood. And these white people, the most pathetic, out of shape, weak, sickly white people, and probably in their 30s, 40s, they had circled this old couple. And they were yelling at them, "This isn't your neighborhood, Nazi. You shouldn't be here, Nazi. Get out of here, Nazi." It turned out, John, that they were Holocaust survivors and that they were Jewish.
Wow.
And this, when I saw that, it reminded me in the late 90s, I was chief of staff for my boss, Mark Moses. And a radical atheist came because he sued my boss. My boss had the Star of David on his door to his office at the legislature. And there's two doors in the Hawaii State Capitol, one for the public and one for the representative. And the judge had ruled that the door that's the representatives, he can put religious symbols on it. And in fact, he had it on the door to his office. He had the Star of David. This guy, 6'4" guy, 6'5" guy, came and took down my boss's Star of David. Well, I, being a young man, who greatly admired my boss, I picked the guy up, body slammed him, put him in a chokehold, and got the Star of David back and put it on the door. But I remember my boss had lupus, and he had a stroke a week before. He just got out of the hospital, and I heard the scraping at the door, and I jumped up, and I thought my boss was having another stroke and was trying to open the door. And so I ran. My blood pressure was up, and I ran, and I grabbed the door, and I saw this guy taking down the Star of David, and he ran away. Before I caught him, and I saw him running away with the Star of David in his clenched fist. And I remember, just went through my mind, not in my country, not in my country. And in our country, the news doesn't report on Antifa bullying an elderly couple that are Holocaust survivors.
And calling them Nazis.
And calling them Nazis because they were probably going to buy an onion from the local grocery store in their neighborhood. Well, what were they doing? You know, they're going to get a coffee and talk, just look at birds. I don't know.
Yeah.
And they're being called Nazis.
This is not America. This is not the America we inherited, and we're not going to leave this hellish nightmare behind for our kids. The left is not going to get away with this. They're not going to successfully steal this election. They're not going to destroy the Senate, the Electoral College, or the Constitution. Listen, I got to run to a meeting, Jason, but it's been great talking to you.
All right, John, thanks. You took extra time with me. I appreciate it.
All right.
All right, guys, I agree with that with John. You know, I thank God I'm a Christian. I was an atheist till I was 30. You know, I'd read Harrison Bergeron and Atlas Shrugged as a young man, 8th year junior high, and was an atheist, was raised an atheist. So is the religion of my mother. And my grandfather was a Scientologist. Can you believe that? But I had read Ayn Rand and was really influenced her, especially after when I was in the Army. My high school girlfriend's father forced her to have an abortion. He was this prominent Christian, sort of was scandalized by Christians. And that's where I was sort of a cradle atheist, didn't take it very serious. But after that experience, I had a reversion and I became a very aggressive atheist. And, you know, I'm too grateful for two things. One, for assenting to the truth of Christianity and having to grapple with things like turn the other cheek, that my enemy is made in the image of God, that they are acting out of ignorance, that they have been abused by our culture, emasculated. These men have been emasculated from their culture. They had fathers who were either not there or there but not men. They were latchkey kids. Their brains were bombarded with media, out of the womb, corrupting their moral imagination. That I think about this a lot, that they were addled with pornography before they were out of elementary school because of, pornography pouring through their computers and then now pouring through their phones, when our pornography was the Sears catalog, right? And you loved the Christmas season because you got the fancy underwear, the girls in the, and it was the underwear section was a little bigger. Now the women are going, this is absolutely disgusting. This was the 70s. I'm just telling you, ask your husband. This is just the reality, okay? But imagine being a kid before you held a young woman's hand. You had seen the most vile pornography. This is the reality. And what that does to a person's imagination, how that prepares them to be used by ideology, how easy it is for them to get swept away by what Rene Girard talks about as this mimetic contagion. By the way, I read Girard every day, more to protect myself, because I feel that I am being swept away in this contagion of violence. When I see elderly people being punched in the face, my first thought is, why couldn't I have been in D.C.? I had to go to Louisville to give a speech. Why couldn't I have been there to stand in between this elderly person and this thug? I don't even want to call them thug because they're fragile, they're out of shape, they're weak, they're just a mob. Just a mob made up of sad, pathetic souls. If you were to get them alone, your heart would break for them. If you were to see them sitting at a coffee shop alone, which I do, I travel around. My thing is people watching. That is my thing. I love it. Yesterday, I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and I was putting on the music of Kentucky. And I was just listening to different music from different artists from Kentucky, walking around, people watching. I went into the cemetery to see Muhammad Ali's grave just yesterday. I went in there and I looked up his playlist of Muhammad Ali's favorite songs. And so I just sat there and walked around the cemetery, praying my rosary. Then I went it was a long walk from the gate I took Uber, from the gate to his grave. So I'm listening to Ali's favorite music as I'm walking to his grave, right? And then I played his playlist of his favorite song. You'd be interested, Google it. I should put his playlist on here. It's interesting, the music. He had a very wide taste in music. What's my point? I've digressed, as I do, always wildly. My point is I people watch because I love people. I love people. When you see the folks that make up the Antifa BLM riots, alone you would love them. But when they get swept away by the crowd, which all of us can do, all of us can be swept away. Many of us are. You are. I am. I don't know if you saw, I should put in the show notes what happened when a BLM guy came to my house last week, knocked on my door, see what happened. I should put it in the show notes. I put it on YouTube. I interviewed the guy afterwards. Here's what we need to do. It's this tension. It's this tension that we do not want to be swept away by this contagion of violence and hate, while at the same time, we have to defend this republic for our posterity. We have to turn the other cheek when we are slapped. But when those who are being slapped around us, when the inheritance of our posterity is being set on fire, we must be warriors. That's the tension. We must pray for the grace to see those in the mob as God sees them. Because when God sees this nonsense, it's like when you watch, have you ever seen, I saw this once, this happened once, I have 7 kids. Once my kids got in a fight, my son Max and Jacob, the 2 of them, and it startled me, and it broke my heart to see my 2 sons fighting. I saw it once, and it startled me, and I put an end to it, that it would never happen again. You know, and I thought back, because me and my brother, God forbid, I'm the older brother, there was maybe from the 4th grade to the 8th grade, we just were, because of me, I was a maladjusted, angry young man. We fought every day. Every day we fought. And, you know, I don't know how that was allowed to continue. But in my house, I saw it once. When God sees, you know, what I see is this decrepit, pathetic maniac punching an elderly person in the face. That's when God sees that, he sees it like when I saw my sons fighting. So I pray for the grace to see it like that. I pray for the grace to know when to turn the other cheek and know when to hold my ground so others are not made victims. And when you allow people to make victims of you, that's not a virtue. When we train people to be thugs, when we train these people that they can hurt you, they'll hurt other people. I don't know how to solve that. I grapple. We all have to grapple with that. I'm going to get Gil Bailey on the show. I want to ask him, help me, mentor me. How do I grapple with the reality, the demand as a Christian to know, I have to know when to turn the other cheek, and I have to know when turning the other cheek is a sin, because I am training someone to be a violent thug, and he will hurt other people, and worse than hurting other people, he will continue to damage his own soul. And I don't want that. You know, when you allow someone to make a victim of you, when you allow that, you've allowed a horrible darkness to fall upon their soul. And this is the great challenge. We are living in the Olympics. This is spiritual exercise Olympics. Spiritual exercise Olympics. That's what we are living in. And so let's, every day when we go out into the world, when we see our neighbors, whether they're wearing a MAGA hat or a Biden hat, a BLM shirt, or an anti-abortion shirt like I wear, when you see that, these folks, we have to remember they're made in the image and likeness of God. And we have to pray for the grace to respond accordingly. This is a great challenge. My hope is that whenever there is disorder enters a community, okay, this is Gerard right here. Whenever disorder enters a community, there's only 2 ways to respond. Scapegoating, finding someone to blame for the disorder and brutalizing them. That brings order. It works. Tragically, it works. Or a life of radical solidarity with those being scapegoated. And so now we see that, for example, can you imagine that this mob was trying to bring order to their community by circling an elderly couple that survived Auschwitz at the beginning of their life, they had to suffer this horrible kind of violence. And at the end of their life, they had to suffer this horrible kind of violence. The beginning of their life, the Nazis were scapegoating the Jews, and they were Jewish at the very beginning of their life. And now this old couple at the end of their life, because they weren't wearing a Star of David around their shoulder, they were just seen by this mob of angry white kids as old white people. So they felt that it was perfectly acceptable to circle them and yell at them and harass them and push them as they tried to cross the street. And the demand on us is, how do we respond? How do we defend those who are being scapegoated? And in a way, how do we defend those from the mimetic contagion that are doing the scapegoating? Because the biggest victim of their cruelty is their own, because the consequences are eternal. And that's the challenge. I don't have the answer, and I am the most volatile person. I say that if I was Saddam Hussein's son, I'd be worse than Uday. But I am so glad I have that in me, because I can feel this mimetic contagion. I can feel what it's like. I'm incited to violence when other people haven't even noticed they're being incited yet. And I thank God for that grace, because it gives me empathy. And I love the struggle. And I hold on with white knuckles not to be swept away. And sometimes I'm swept away. And then I say, like Steve Harvey says, I ain't that great of a Christian yet. So that's all. That's it. This has been another episode of the Jason Jones Show, back from the road, back from Washington, D.C., back from Louisville, Kentucky. I should have talked more about that, but this past trip. Maybe I'll do it later in the week. But go to movie2movement.com and check out our movie Divided Hearts of America. Today's the last day you can get it on pay-per-view. Today. If you haven't seen Divided Hearts of America yet, go to movie2movement.com. You can click through our site and see it on pay-per-view. If you don't do it today, you'll have to wait till it's at another place. And the Vulnerable People Project. Go to thegreatcampaign.org. Sign up to become a monthly donor, because our work is the most important work on earth. I was just on Steve Bannon's show, and I think this was a bit of an exaggeration. It was nice of him to say, but Steve Bannon said that our work, and he was talking about the Vulnerable People Project, was the primary reason the Trump movement and the Trump campaign, the Trump administration had ordered itself around protecting the Yazidis, standing with the Uyghur, fighting for the Kurds. And that meant a lot for me to hear from him. And our mission is to stand between the vulnerable and the violent, and stand with the most vulnerable people in the world, the vulnerable in the most vulnerable moments of their life. And in the next year, David Beasley from the World Food Program said 2021 will be the biggest year in famine that maybe in history, recorded history. It's going to be, if we go to a year lockdown, the Biden says, famine will be of epic proportion in Africa and in Asia. And we will be there with them fighting for their interests. Those concentration camps in East Turkestan, if Biden is president, they may turn into death camps. And we're already moving to be very creative to advance the interests of the Uyghur. You're going to be surprised. We have some big folks that are getting ready to come out and stand with us. So you become a monthly donor, and you're standing with the child in the womb in Gary, Indiana, and you're standing with those folks in the concentration camps in Chinese-occupied East Turkestan. You're with the Christians and the Kurds in Syria. You're with the Nuba in the mountains of Sudan. And that is our mission, to advance the interests of the vulnerable. And you do that by going to thegreatcampaign.org and becoming a monthly donor. And if you become a monthly donor, you get a free copy of my book, The Race to Save Our Century. All right? Another long and meandering conclusion. I may get a prescription for Ritalin so I can tighten these conclusions up. Until next time, it's the Jason Jones Show. Be vulnerable.
This This has been The Jason Jones Show, powered by Mudhouse Media.